Hello there. Tonight we are going somewhere that the official timeline of human civilization insists we cannot go. Back before Sumer, before Egypt, before the cities whose names appear in the earliest records of writing, back into the period that historians call prehistory, and that the evidence on the ground increasingly refuses to behave like prehistory at all. We are going to spend the next 2 hours with the structures, the artifacts, the astronomical alignments, the flood narratives, the genetic evidence, and the uncomfortable geological findings that collectively suggest that the story we tell ourselves about when human civilization began is not wrong exactly, but incomplete in ways that matter enormously. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and like the video and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Now let's begin. The official beginning of human civilization is usually placed at around 3100 BC in Mesopotamia, with the emergence of the Sumerian city-states and the development of cuneiform writing. This date has been so consistently taught, so thoroughly repeated across so many textbooks and documentaries and popular histories, that it has acquired the solidity of established fact. And there is real truth embedded in it. Cuneiform writing does appear at roughly this date. The Sumerian city-states are real. The archaeological record of Uruk and Eridu and Ur supports a genuine flowering of urban complexity in southern Mesopotamia at around this time. But the date of this flowering is not the same as the date of its origins. A city does not appear fully formed out of nothing. A writing system does not spring into existence without a preceding tradition of symbolic representation. A legal code, and the Sumerians had one of the earliest we know of, does not emerge in a society that has never thought systematically about law. Something came before. The question is what and how far before, and how much of it survived. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is the single most disruptive archaeological discovery of the last century for the conventional timeline of human civilization. It is a series of enclosures on a hilltop in the region of ancient Anatolia, built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in rings, decorated with carved reliefs of animals: foxes, scorpions, lions, vultures, crocodiles, and more, and with abstract symbols whose meaning has not been fully decoded. The pillars are enormous. Some stand 5 to 6 meters tall and weigh approximately 10 to 20 tons each. They were quarried at a site 500 meters away and transported and erected with a precision that suggests either a highly organized labor force or a technical capability in stoneworking that the archaeological consensus was not prepared to find in this period. The date of Göbekli Tepe, established through multiple radiocarbon analyses and confirmed and reconfirmed by the German Archaeological Institute team that has been excavating it since 1996, is approximately 9600 BC. This is not a contested date. The structure is approximately 11,000 years old, and it predates the beginning of agriculture in the region. It predates the invention of the wheel. It predates pottery. It predates every other monumental building project in the archaeological record by approximately 6,000 years. The implications of Göbekli Tepe for our understanding of human prehistory are not fully absorbed into the mainstream narrative yet, and the resistance to absorbing them is understandable because they are genuinely destabilizing. The conventional account of the development of civilization runs roughly like this. Hunter-gatherer societies developed agriculture over thousands of years of gradual experimentation, and the surplus food production that agriculture enabled eventually allowed some members of society to stop farming and begin specializing in trade, in craft, in governance, in religion. This surplus and specialization created the conditions for urbanization, for writing, for monumental architecture. In this account, monumental architecture is a late product of civilizational development, something that emerges after agriculture, after urbanism, after the social organization that can direct collective labor toward a non-subsistence project. Göbekli Tepe reverses this sequence. It is monumental architecture before agriculture. It is organized religious or ceremonial construction by people who, the archaeology tells us, were hunter-gatherers. Either the conventional account of civilizational development is wrong in important ways, or the people who built Göbekli Tepe were more complex, more socially organized, more capable of abstract symbolic thought than hunter-gatherers are supposed to have been. Both of these possibilities are extraordinary. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavation of Göbekli Tepe from 1996 until his death in 2014, proposed that the site inverts the traditional understanding of the relationship between religion and agriculture. Rather than agriculture enabling the surplus that enabled religion, Schmidt argued that the impulse to gather for religious ceremony drove the development of agriculture, that the need to feed the builders and the worshippers at Göbekli Tepe created the pressure to domesticate the wild grasses that grew in the surrounding region. The Karadag mountain range near Göbekli Tepe is, in fact, one of the primary candidate regions for the origin of einkorn wheat, one of the earliest domesticated cereals. Whether this connection is causal in the way Schmidt proposed remains debated. But the geographical coincidence is striking and the chronological coincidence is striking, and Schmidt's proposal is taken seriously by many archaeobotanists working in the region. Religion built before surplus. Ceremony driving agriculture rather than following it. The entire sequence of civilizational development potentially needing to be re-evaluated. Below the current surface of Göbekli Tepe, geophysical surveys have revealed that the known enclosures, the ones that have been excavated and that appear in every documentary and news article about the site, represent approximately 5% of the total extent of the buried complex. Geomagnetic surveys have identified the outlines of at least 20 additional enclosures beneath the surface. The excavated portions have taken more than 25 years of active work by international teams. The full site will not be excavated within any currently living person's lifetime. What this means is that everything we know about Göbekli Tepe is based on a tiny fraction of the evidence, and that the evidence we have is already sufficient to overturn major assumptions about human prehistory. The full picture, when it eventually emerges, may be more transformative still. The site was also deliberately buried. This is not the result of natural silting or gradual accumulation. Someone, or many people, over some period of time, systematically filled the enclosures with soil and rubble and stone chips, covering the pillars, burying the reliefs, sealing the complex. Why a community would deliberately bury its most important ceremonial site is one of the questions that archaeology has not satisfactorily answered. One possibility is preservation, burying the structures to protect them from some anticipated threat. One possibility is ritual closure, ending a phase of ceremonial life in a way that was considered complete and final. The burial may itself be the most significant act associated with the site, and we do not understand it. 8,000 kilometers west of Göbekli Tepe, in the Atlantic Ocean, there is an archipelago called the Azores, and beneath the waters surrounding it are structures that the geological record cannot fully account for. The Azores sit on a tectonic triple junction, the meeting point of the North American, Eurasian, and African plates, and the islands themselves are the tips of volcanic seamounts that have been rising from the seafloor for millions of years. The underwater geology of the region is complex and poorly understood, but what sonar mapping has revealed in the waters around the islands and what divers and remotely operated vehicles have occasionally photographed is a category of structure that appears too regular, too geometric, and in some cases too precisely oriented to be the product of purely geological processes. Walls, platforms, what appear to be roads or causeways following the contours of submerged terrain. None of this is definitively proven to be artificial. The relevant geological processes, columnar jointing, hydrothermal alteration, Repeated cycles of lava deposition and erosion can produce formations that superficially resemble constructed structures, but the regularity of some of the formations near the Azores has prompted a number of researchers to propose that portions of the mid-Atlantic ridge system were above water during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, and that if humans were present in this region at that time, the traces of their habitation are now on the seafloor. The glacial maximum, the period between approximately 26,000 and 19,000 years ago when the ice sheets were at their greatest extent and global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today, is a period that mainstream archaeology has largely ignored as a possible context for early civilization, for the simple reason that most of the land that was exposed during this period is now underwater. The continental shelves of every ocean in the world were dry land during the glacial maximum. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The North Sea was a vast plain that connected Britain to continental Europe. Sunderland, the region that is now Indonesia and the surrounding shallow seas, was a landmass nearly the size of India. The Sunda Shelf, stretching from the Malay Peninsula to what are now the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java, contained enormous river systems and fertile lowland plains. All of this land is now beneath 50 to 120 meters of water, and almost none of it has been systematically archaeologically surveyed. When researchers argue that there may be evidence of pre-glacial maximum civilization that we have simply not found yet, they are not making an extraordinary claim. They are making the observation that we have not looked in the places where the evidence would most likely be. Graham Hancock, the writer who has done more than any other single person to popularize the hypothesis of a lost prehistoric civilization, has argued for more than 30 years that the sea level rise following the end of the last ice age constitutes a systematic erasure of the physical evidence for early human civilization. His argument is not that archaeologists are engaged in a conspiracy of suppression, he is careful about this, but that the methodology of terrestrial archaeology is, by structural necessity, blind to any civilization that was located primarily in the coastal regions that are now submerged. The criticism of Hancock's work from mainstream archaeology has been substantial and in many cases justified. He has drawn conclusions from insufficient evidence, made arguments by analogy that do not hold up under scrutiny, and associated himself with researchers whose work is poorly documented. But the core geological observations that 120 meters of sea level rise over roughly 10,000 years would have erased the physical traces of any coastal civilization that existed during or before that period is not controversial within geology itself. The controversy is about whether any such civilization existed, and on that question the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The Yonaguni Monument, discovered in 1987 off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan, is the most intensely debated of the potential underwater prehistoric sites. It is a massive rock formation sitting on a platform approximately 25 meters below the current sea surface, with flat vertical faces, right-angle corners, a series of terraced levels, what appears to be a road running along its base, and several features that look remarkably like carved stairs and pillars. The formation is approximately 150 meters long and 40 meters wide, and rises approximately 27 meters from the surrounding seafloor. The debate about it is sharp and has been running for nearly 4 decades. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, spent years diving the site and argued that the angular features, the flat surfaces, the right-angle junctions, and the regular terracing are too consistent and too extensive to be natural. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University better known for his controversial redating of the Sphinx, argued after diving the site that while some features are intriguing, the overall formation can be explained by the natural fracturing and erosion of the local sandstone, which tends to split along horizontal and vertical planes. The truth appears to be, based on the available evidence, that the Yonaguni Monument is a natural geological formation with features that were modified or enhanced by human hands. This intermediate position in natural base human modification is less dramatic than either the fully artificial or the fully natural interpretation, but it is the position that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. And if it is correct, it implies human presence in the region at a time when that part of the Ryukyu Shelf was above water, which would place it at approximately 10,000 years ago. The richest structure in Mauritania, the Eye of the Sahara, as it is known from satellite imagery, is a geological formation approximately 50 kilometers across that looks from orbit like an enormous bullseye or a circular city plan. It is a dome of Precambrian rock that has been eroded over millions of years, its concentric rings the result of differential weathering of different rock layers. For decades it was considered purely geological, a curiosity visible from space with no particular archaeological significance. In recent years, it has attracted attention from researchers who argue that the specific dimensions of the Risha structure, the diameter of its rings, the depth of the central crater, the orientation of its major features, match with suspicious precision the description given by Plato in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias of the city of Atlantis. The measurements are genuinely close. The Rishi structure sits in the Sahara, which was a green and habitable landscape during the African humid period, roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, when the monsoons extended much further north than they do today, and the region that is now desert was covered in lakes, rivers, grasslands, and forests. If a sophisticated culture existed in northwestern Africa during this period and built in the region of the Risha structure, the Saharan desiccation that followed the end of the African humid period would have buried and scattered its remains under sand. The connection between the Riche structure and Atlantis is speculative and contested, but the question of whether it deserves serious investigation is less easily dismissed than the mainstream response has typically allowed. Plato's Atlantis presents one of the most enduring and most debated problems in the history of lost civilization research, and the reason it has endured for 2,400 years, since Plato wrote about it, is that the account has internal features that are difficult to explain if the whole thing is a pure invention. Plato describes Atlantis in two dialogues written around 360 BC. He presents the story as historical fact, received through a chain of transmission that begins with the Athenian statesman Solon, who allegedly heard it from Egyptian priests during a visit to the temple city of Sais in the Nile Delta in approximately 590 BC. The priests, Plato says, told Solon that the Athenians had forgotten their own ancient history because periodic catastrophes, floods, fires, other disasters had repeatedly destroyed the literate population of Greece, while the Egyptians, protected by the Nile's regular flooding, had maintained continuous records going back much further. Among these records, the priests said, was an account of a great war that Athens had fought against a maritime empire based on an island in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 9,000 years before Solon's visit. This dating would place the events around 9600 BC, which is not only before any currently recognized civilization, but is also approximately the date of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the catastrophic climate event that ended the last ice age. The Younger Dryas is a period of abrupt climate cooling that occurred approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted for roughly 1,200 years before an equally abrupt warming returned the Earth to interglacial conditions. The cause of the Younger Dryas cooling has been debated for decades, and the mainstream geological explanation, a massive influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic from the melting Laurentide ice sheet disrupting the ocean circulation system, remains the most widely accepted. But in 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proposing that the Younger Dryas was triggered not by meltwater alone, but by a cosmic impact or airburst, fragments of a comet or asteroid striking the surface of the Laurentide ice sheet and the surrounding regions, producing fires, ejecta, and a nuclear winter-like cooling effect. The evidence they cited included a thin layer of material found at younger Dryas boundary sites across North America and Europe, containing nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, iridium, and other materials associated with cosmic impact events. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been intensely contested. Several of the original claims have not been independently replicated. The interpretation of the evidence has been challenged on multiple grounds, but the hypothesis has not been definitively refuted, and in 2018 a large independent study published in the Journal of Geology provided new supporting evidence, including the identification of Younger Dryas boundary layer materials at multiple sites in South America and South Africa that had not been part of the original dataset. The debate continues, and it matters enormously for the question of lost civilizations, because an impact event at this scale, at this date, is precisely the kind of catastrophic event that could have destroyed a civilization that was flourishing in the coastal regions of the late Pleistocene world. The flood myths. Every civilization in the world that we know of from the ancient record has a flood myth, an account of a catastrophic inundation that destroyed the previous world. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest written documents we have, describes a list of kings who ruled before the flood and a separate list of kings who ruled after it, with the transition marked explicitly. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian version of the flood narrative that predates the biblical account of Noah by more than 1,000 years, describes a hero named Utnapishtim, who received warning of the flood from the god Ea, built a vessel, survived with his family and representatives of all living creatures, and was rewarded with immortality. The biblical flood narrative, whatever its relationship to the Mesopotamian accounts, and the relationship is close enough that verbal borrowings seem likely, describes the same essential events. The Hindu tradition contains the story of Manu, who was warned by a fish of the coming flood, built a vessel, and survived to repopulate the earth. The Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, the Aboriginal Australians, the Norse, the Greeks, the Chinese. Virtually every culture from every part of the world has a version of this story. The conventional explanation is that flood myths are universal, because floods are universal. Rivers flood, coasts flood, people drown, communities lose everything, and the psychological impact of catastrophic flooding is sufficient to generate the mythological category of world-ending inundation without any single historical event needing to have actually occurred. This explanation is adequate if you are satisfied with it. If you are not satisfied with it, if you are troubled by the specificity of details that recur across cultures that had no known contact with each other, the divine warning, the vessel, the animals, the mountain landing, the hero who preserves knowledge and receives divine favor, then the hypothesis of a common historical origin for these myths becomes harder to dismiss. The Sumerian records specifically describe beings called the Anunnaki, whose name translates most directly as something like those of the heavens and earth, and the Apkallu, the 7 sages who existed before the flood and who taught humans the arts of civilization. The Apkallu are described in the texts as half human and half fish, or as emerging from the sea, and they are credited with transmitting writing, agriculture, law, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy to humanity. Their teacher role is explicit. The texts describe specific Apkallu teaching specific skills to specific pre-flood kings. The standard academic interpretation of the Apkallu is that they are mythological culture heroes, the Mesopotamian equivalent of the Greek Titans or the Vedic Rishis, supernatural ancestors who stand at the origin of civilization and whose supernatural nature explains the extraordinary accomplishment of having founded it. This interpretation is probably correct in the sense that the Apkallu as described are clearly mythological figures and not literal historical people. But the question that the mythological interpretation often fails to fully engage with is why so many unrelated cultures tell the same story of wise beings who came before the flood and brought civilization to humans. The Dogon of Mali have the Nomo, amphibious beings from the sky, who taught them cosmological knowledge. The ancient Chinese records describe the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, semi-divine teachers who established the foundations of Chinese civilization. The Maya describe the Bakabs, the Vukub Kakwiks, the hero twins, a complex mythological system that in various readings describes the transmission of astronomical and agricultural knowledge from supernatural sources. The details differ because cultures differ. The underlying pattern, civilization was transmitted to us from beings who preceded the current human world, is strikingly consistent. The astronomical alignments of ancient monuments have been studied seriously since the 1960s, when Gerald Hawkins published his analysis of Stonehenge in the journal Nature, arguing that the monument was a sophisticated astronomical calculator capable of predicting eclipses and tracking the movements of the sun and moon. Hawkins's work was initially dismissed and then gradually accepted, and it opened a field of archaeoastronomy that has since produced detailed analyses of the astronomical orientations of monuments across the world. What this research has revealed is a consistent pattern. The most important monumental building projects of ancient and prehistoric cultures were oriented, sometimes with extraordinary precision, toward significant astronomical events. Solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting of particular stars at particular dates, the movements of the moon across its 18.6-year cycle. This is true of the Egyptian pyramids, of Stonehenge, of Newgrange in Ireland, of the temples of Malta, of the megalithic monuments of Brittany, of the rock art sites of South Africa, of the Nazca lines of Peru, of the temples of the Maya and the observatory buildings of Mesoamerica. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these structures is in many cases sophisticated enough that reproducing it would require careful observation over many generations, precise recording of that observation, and the mathematical capacity to extrapolate from recorded observations to predictions. This is not the knowledge of simple agricultural communities. It is the knowledge of a systematic, cumulative observational tradition. The Dendera zodiac is a circular bas-relief carved on the ceiling of a chapel in the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, dating in its current form to approximately the 1st century BC, the Ptolemaic period. It depicts the constellations of the Egyptian zodiac in an arrangement that, when analyzed astronomically, records the positions of the stars as they would have been visible from Egypt at approximately 10,900 BC. This is not a mainstream interpretation. The standard Egyptological reading is that the zodiac is a symbolic and religious representation rather than a precise astronomical record, and that the date indicated by its stellar positions is either coincidental or the result of a deliberate reference to a mythologically significant past date rather than an actual observation. But the precision of the stellar positions is difficult to account for as coincidence, and the date, once again arriving in the vicinity of 10,000 to 11,000 BC, the same period as Göbekli Tepe, the same period as the Younger Dryas, the same period that Plato's Egyptian priests claimed for the Atlantis War, is striking. Robert Bauval, the engineer who proposed the Orion correlation theory in 1989, argues that the layout of the Giza Plateau, the 3 Great Pyramids in their relative sizes and positions, mirrors the 3 stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in the sky in approximately 10,500 BC, when the constellation would have been at the lowest point of its precessional cycle. The correlation is visually compelling. The debate about whether it is intentional or coincidental has been ongoing for 35 years. The precession of the equinoxes is a phenomenon caused by the slow wobble of the Earth's rotational axis as it traces a circle against the background stars over a period of approximately 25,120 years. Because of this wobble, the position of the Sun on the spring equinox, the point in the sky against which the sunrise is seen on the first day of spring, moves through the constellations of the zodiac, spending approximately 2,060 years in each constellation before moving to the next. The knowledge of this cycle requires observations accumulated over a period of centuries, and the belief of many archaeoastronomers is that it could not have been discovered from scratch by any single generation of observers. It was the accumulated inheritance of an observational tradition that had been running for a very long time. Hipparchus of Nicaea is traditionally credited with the Western discovery of precession in approximately 127 BC. But the Vedic texts of ancient India describe a system of 27 or 28 lunar mansions, whose arrangement and the timing of certain texts imply knowledge of the precession cycle going back at least 4,000 years before Hipparchus. The zodiacal system used in Babylonian astronomy appears to encode precessional knowledge that predates the earliest Babylonian texts by thousands of years. Jocelyn Godwin, Giorgio de Santillana, and Hertha von Deschend, in their dense and extraordinary book Hamlet's Mill, published in 1969, argued that precession was the secret astronomical knowledge encoded in the world's mythological traditions. That stories about millstones that grind out the world, about gods who shift the heavens, about the slow turning of the celestial sphere, were all disguised descriptions of the 25,920-year precessional cycle. Whether or not their specific interpretations hold, the broader argument that precession was known far earlier than the standard history of astronomy acknowledges is difficult to completely dismiss. The Serapeum at Saqqara in Egypt contains one of the most physically extraordinary and most under-discussed collections of objects from the ancient world. It is a series of underground tunnels cut into the bedrock of the Saqqara Plateau, lined on either side with enormous sarcophagi carved from solid blocks of black granite and pink Aswan granite. The sarcophagi are massive, approximately 3.7 meters long, 2.3 meters wide, and 2.3 meters tall, with lids that weigh approximately 27 tons each. There are 24 of them arranged in alcoves cut into the walls of the tunnels. They were supposedly used for the burial of the Apis bulls, the sacred bulls associated with the god Ptah, and this explanation is the standard Egyptological one. But the precision with which the sarcophagi were made is extraordinary even by modern standards. The interior surfaces are flat to within fractions of a millimeter. The corners are perfectly square, measured with modern instruments, to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch. The lids fit the boxes with a precision that requires both surfaces to have been finished simultaneously, because any deviation in the finishing of one affects how the other must be finished to match. This level of precision in granite, a material that is exceptionally hard, that requires specialized tools and techniques to work, and that does not forgive errors because each cut is effectively permanent, implies a level of stoneworking technology and expertise that is significantly in advance of what standard Egyptology attributes to the period. The question of how the Serapeum boxes were made has not been satisfactorily answered. The question of why Apis bull burials required this level of precision has not been satisfactorily answered either. The precision machining question recurs throughout Egyptian archaeology when the physical evidence is examined closely enough. Chris Dunn, a mechanical engineer who has spent decades studying the tool marks and surface finishes of ancient Egyptian stone objects, has documented a range of features in Egyptian granite and basalt artifacts that cannot be explained by the tools and techniques that Egyptology attributes to the period. Circular saw marks on granite blocks with radii of curvature that imply the use of a rotating blade, not a simple abrasive, but an actual saw blade spinning at speed. core drill holes in granite whose helical grooves indicate a feed rate of approximately 2.5 millimeters per revolution, faster than modern diamond-tipped core drills achieve in granite. Bowls carved from diorite, a rock harder than granite, with interior surfaces that are geometrically perfect to tolerances that would challenge a modern CNC machine. The Egyptological response to these observations has generally been that they are misidentifications, that the features Dunn and others describe as machining marks are the result of manual techniques applied with extraordinary patience and skill, that the precision can be achieved by dedicated craftsmen over long periods, and that the absence of machine tools from the archaeological record is the decisive argument against any machined interpretation. These responses are reasonable but not fully satisfying. The absence of machine tools from the archaeological record is an absence of positive evidence, not evidence of absence. The tool marks remain, and their explanation remains inadequate. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the most discussed and most over-theorized object in the history of lost civilization research, and it is worth approaching it from a specific angle rather than covering the full spectrum of claims, because the specific angle is the most interesting one and the least often taken. The angle is this, even within completely orthodox Egyptological assumptions, accepting that the pyramid was built under Khufu in the Old Kingdom period, circa 2560 BC, using the tools and techniques that the mainstream assigns to that period. The pyramid represents an achievement of planning and execution that is so far beyond any other known building project of comparable antiquity that it constitutes a genuine historical anomaly. It is not just that it is large, though it is extraordinarily large. It is that its dimensions are precise to a degree that was not matched in Europe until the 19th century. The base sides are equal to within 58 millimeters across a length of approximately 230 meters. The four corners are right angles to within 12 arc seconds. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across the entire 53,000 square meter base area. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north, not magnetic north, true north, to within 3/60ths of a degree. The alignment to true north is more precise than that of the Paris meridian, and it predates the Paris meridian by more than 4,000 years. Whatever tools and techniques the builders used, they were capable of surveying and engineering at a precision that most historians of technology would not assign to their period. The internal dimensions of the Great Pyramid encode the value of pi to four significant figures in the ratio of its height to the circumference of its base. They encode the value of phi, the golden ratio, in the ratio of its slant height to half its base. The ratio of its base perimeter to its height multiplied by 2 gives the number 2p to a precision of less than 1,000th of a percent. The pyramid's height of 146.6 meters multiplied by 43,200 gives the polar radius of the Earth to within 0.2%. The base perimeter of 921.4 meters multiplied by 43,200 gives the equatorial circumference of the Earth to within 0.5%. The number 43,200 is half of 86,400, which is the number of seconds in a day. Whether these relationships are intentional or coincidental has been debated since John Taylor first noticed some of them in 1859 and Charles Piazzi Smith developed the analysis in the 1860s. Modern statistical analyses have reached different conclusions depending on the methodology applied. The precision of the physical dimensions is not in dispute. Whether the encoding was deliberate is the question. But the encoding of the Earth's dimensions into a monument that predates accurate cartographic knowledge of the Earth's dimensions by several thousand years is, at minimum, an extraordinary coincidence that deserves a better explanation than it has so far received. The megaliths of Pumapunku in Bolivia sit at an altitude of approximately 3,025 meters above sea level on the Bolivian Altiplano, near the ruins of the ancient city of Tiwanaku. They are the most precisely worked stones in the ancient world outside of Egypt, and in some respects they exceed the precision of Egyptian work. They are made primarily from red sandstone and grey andesite, the andesite quarried from a source approximately 90 kilometers away from the site. The red sandstone blocks are flat and regular to a degree that, according to researchers who have measured them with modern instruments, they can be stacked without mortar, and light cannot pass between the interfaces. The andesite blocks are carved with H-shaped indentations and interlocking tenons of extraordinary geometric precision. The same H-shaped profile appears repeatedly on different blocks, consistently shaped as if produced to a template. Notches, grooves, and recesses are cut into the blocks with a regularity and a precision that is extremely difficult to explain with hand tools alone. The mainstream archaeological date for Puma Punku is approximately 500 to 600 AD, which would place it within a period of relatively advanced Andean civilization. Arthur Posnansky, a Bolivian archaeologist who studied Tiwanaku extensively in the early 20th century, proposed a date of approximately 15,000 BC based on astronomical alignments, a claim that has been widely rejected. The most unsettling aspect of Puma Punku is simply the precision, independent of any dating question, because the precision does not have an obvious explanation in the standard account of Andean technology. The Nazca lines of southern Peru, the enormous geoglyphs scraped into the desert surface of the Nazca Plateau and visible only from altitude, have been the subject of continuous study since their scientific documentation in the 1940s. The figures include representations of animals, a hummingbird, a condor, a spider, a monkey, a dog, fish, a lizard, a killer whale, a flower. They include purely geometric forms, spirals, rectangles, trapezoids, perfectly straight lines extending for kilometers across the undulating surface of the plateau without deviation. The straight lines are among the most puzzling features. Some of them extend for more than 20 kilometers across terrain that rises and falls, curves and bends, and yet the lines remain perfectly straight across the surface. This requires either constant surveying as the line is extended, maintaining direction by some systematic reference point, or the use of a reference that can provide a consistent bearing across long distances. The height hypothesis, that the Nazca people were able to fly in hot air balloons or some other aerial vehicle and used this aerial perspective to lay out and check the lines, is speculative and unsupported. The mathematical surveying hypothesis, involving the use of long measuring cords and systematic triangulation, is plausible and is supported by the mathematical analysis of the layouts. But the purpose of the lines and the specific reason why a culture without wheels or writing or large-scale trade networks would invest the enormous collective labor required to create them remains genuinely unexplained. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, is an analog computing device of such sophistication that its existence in the 1st century BC was initially considered impossible. It is a clockwork mechanism of bronze gears, approximately 30 of which survive in varying states of preservation, that was designed to calculate the positions of the sun and moon, predict eclipses according to the Saros cycle, track the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games, and display the months according to multiple calendar systems simultaneously. The Saros cycle, which is the 18-year 11-day cycle of eclipse recurrence, requires accurate knowledge of the synodic and anomalistic periods of the moon and the accurate relationship between them, knowledge that implies centuries of careful astronomical observation. The mechanism's construction implies knowledge not only of these astronomical relationships but also of the differential gear, which was not thought to have been invented until approximately the 16th century AD. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that ancient Greek technology was capable of things that the standard history of technology assigned to the Renaissance or later. The question it raises for the broader history of technology is how much else was lost, how many other devices, other manuscripts, other bodies of knowledge were destroyed in the burning of Alexandria, the sackings of Carthage and Athens and Constantinople, the repeated cycles of civilizational collapse and recovery that characterize Mediterranean history. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example of a catastrophic loss of ancient knowledge, but its fame has somewhat obscured the broader pattern of which it is an instance. The ancient world was full of books. Callimachus, the 3rd century BC Alexandrian librarian, reportedly compiled a 120-volume catalogue of the library's holdings. Estimates of the library's collection at its peak range from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. It was not the only great library of antiquity. The Royal Library of Nineveh, assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC, contained tens of thousands of clay tablets covering history, science, medicine, mathematics, and literature. The library of the Ptolemaic Serapeum contained another major collection. The libraries of the great philosophical schools in Athens, the Academy, the Lyceum, the Stoa, held the accumulated writings of the Greek intellectual tradition. Almost all of it is gone. Of the 340 works known to have been written by Aristotle, 31 survive. Of the 440 plays known to have been written by the 3 great Athenian tragedians, 33 survive. Of the entire corpus of Etruscan literature, 1 heavily damaged bronze tablet and a few hundred short inscriptions survive. The pre-Columbian libraries of Mesoamerica, the bark paper books of the Maya, the Aztec, the Mixtec, were systematically destroyed by the Spanish in the 16th century. 4 complete Maya books survive. The Spanish bishop Diego de Landa burned an unknown number of Maya books in a single bonfire at Mani in 1562 and recorded afterward, with apparent satisfaction, that the Maya had wept. What was in those books we will never know. The oral traditions of indigenous cultures around the world have preserved, across thousands of years of continuous transmission, accounts that appear to contain accurate information about geological and astronomical events that occurred long before the development of writing. The Aboriginal Australian oral traditions contain accounts of sea level rise, specific descriptions of coastlines that are now underwater, specific descriptions of the submergence of land that was previously inhabited, that geologists have verified against the known sea level history of the Australian coast. In at least 2 cases, the traditions appear to preserve accurate information about events that occurred between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. Patrick Nunn and Nick Reed at the University of the Sunshine Coast have documented 21 such accounts from around the Australian coast and argued that they constitute oral records of specific geological events, specific locations where the sea rose, specific communities that were forced to relocate, that have been transmitted accurately across more than 200 generations. If this interpretation is correct, it implies a standard of accuracy in oral transmission that challenges the common assumption that oral traditions cannot preserve reliable historical information across millennia. It also implies that the Aboriginal Australians were present on specific coastal areas that are now submerged, and were observing and recording the processes by which those areas became submerged for thousands of years before the end of the glacial maximum. The Dogon people of Mali present one of the most mysterious and most debated cases in the anthropology of ancient astronomical knowledge. The Dogon were studied extensively in the 1930s and 1940s by the French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germain Dieterlen, who spent decades learning the Dogon language and gaining access to the secret religious knowledge of the Dogon priestly tradition. What Griaule and Dieterlen reported finding in the Dogon's cosmological system was a detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system. Specifically, the knowledge that Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, has a companion star called Sirius B, a white dwarf that orbits the primary star with a period of approximately 50 years, and whose existence was confirmed by Western astronomy only in 1862 and first directly photographed only in 1970. The Dogon, Griaule reported, knew the orbital period of Sirius B, knew that it was a small and incredibly dense object, and represented it symbolically as the heaviest star. They also appeared to know of a third body in the Sirius system, Sirius C, whose existence is still debated in Western astronomy. The anthropological establishment has largely dismissed Griaule's reports as contamination. The Dogon learned these facts from contact with Western astronomers, perhaps from a French missionary who had been educated in astronomy. This explanation cannot be definitively refuted, since the timing of Griaule's encounters with the Dogon is not sufficiently documented to rule it out. But the contamination hypothesis is also not proven, and the Dogon knowledge was embedded in a complex symbolic and mythological system that would be difficult to account for as the rapid adoption of a few astronomical facts from a Western contact. The mathematics of ancient Mesopotamia are one of the most revealing windows into the sophistication of pre-modern knowledge systems. The Babylonians used a base 60 numerical system, sexagesimal mathematics, that we still use today in the measurement of time and angles, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They knew the value of pi to 3 significant figures. They had a version of what we call the Pythagorean theorem, recorded on the tablet known as Plimpton 322, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. They calculated the length of the solar year with an error of less than 3 minutes. Their astronomical observations of the movements of Venus, preserved in a text known as the Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa, extend over a period of 21 years and are precise enough that modern astronomers have used them to verify ancient chronological dating. The question that Babylonian mathematics raises is not about the Babylonians specifically, they were clearly a sophisticated civilization, but about the origin of their knowledge. The sexagesimal system did not originate with the Babylonians. It was inherited from the Sumerians who preceded them, and the Sumerian mathematical tradition, when traced back to its earliest documented forms, appears already mature, already systematic, already capable of the complex calculations that would take centuries of development if invented from scratch. The Sumerians seem to have inherited their mathematical tradition from somewhere, and that somewhere has not been identified. The distribution of pyramid building across cultures that had no known contact with each other is one of the most physically striking of the architectural anomalies in the lost civilization debate. Pyramids appear in Egypt, in Sudan, in Mesoamerica, among the Maya and the Aztec, in Peru, in Indonesia, at Candi Suku and Gunung Padang, in the Canary Islands, at Guimar, in China, at the Imperial Mausoleums, in Bosnia, at the Vysochica Hill Formation. They appear in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The mainstream explanation is convergent evolution of architectural form. The pyramid is the natural shape that results when you build a large structure with limited technology, because it is the form that most efficiently concentrates mass at the base and reduces load as height increases. This explanation is structurally sound and probably accounts for some of the cross-cultural similarity, but it does not fully account for the specific astronomical alignments that appear in pyramidal structures across cultures. The orientation to cardinal directions, the encoding of solar and lunar events, the apparent awareness of precessional cycles. The architectural convergence explanation addresses the form. It does not address the encoded knowledge. Gunung Padang in West Java, Indonesia, is a site that has received relatively little attention in English-language media, but whose implications, if the most recent research is confirmed, would make it the most significant archaeological discovery in modern history. The site was initially recognized as a megalithic structure, a stepped pyramid of volcanic andesite columns arranged in terraces on a hilltop, and dated to the Sundanese megalithic period of approximately 2000 to 1500 BC, making it remarkable but not extraordinarily so. In 2012, a team led by the Indonesian geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaya began conducting deep geological surveys of the site using ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and core drilling. What they found beneath the surface layers was a series of additional construction layers extending to considerable depth, with the deepest layers, if the core drilling data are correctly interpreted, potentially dating to between 22,000 and 27,000 years ago, deep into the last glacial maximum. The radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the deeper layers has been disputed, and the interpretation of the geophysical data has been contested by other Indonesian geologists. The Indonesian government temporarily halted the excavation, which has been resumed and continues. The evidence is not yet conclusive, but if the deeper layers are as old as Natawijaya's team claims, and if they are indeed constructed rather than natural, then Gunung Padang is a pyramid built at the peak of the last ice age by a human culture that should not, according to current archaeological consensus, have been capable of monumental construction. The genetic evidence for human prehistory has, over the last 2 decades, become one of the most important and most rapidly developing sources of information about what happened in the deep human past. Ancient DNA extracted from human remains at archaeological sites across the world has revealed a picture of prehistoric human movement, mixing, and displacement that is far more complex than the previous generation of archaeologists imagined. It has revealed the existence of previously unknown human populations. The Denisovans, identified from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave and known primarily through DNA rather than physical fossils, and has shown that Homo sapiens interbred with both Neanderthals and Denisovans during the period of modern human expansion out of Africa. It has shown that the populations who built Stonehenge were almost completely replaced within a few centuries by the people of the Bell-Beaker culture arriving from the steppe. It has shown that the ancestral population of almost all modern Europeans arrived in Europe only about 4,500 years ago from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, replacing an earlier Neolithic farming population that had itself replaced an earlier hunter-gatherer population. The picture of prehistoric human life that emerges from ancient DNA is one of repeated expansion, displacement, admixture, and replacement, a much more turbulent and contingent history than the smooth developmental arc that the traditional archaeological narrative implied, and crucially, the genetic record contains gaps and anomalies that suggest episodes of population disruption, bottlenecks, sudden replacements, the disappearance of entire genetic lineages that correspond in timing, in some cases, to the catastrophic events that the lost civilization hypothesis proposes. The Toba supervolcanic eruption approximately 74,000 years ago was one of the largest volcanic events in the last few million years of Earth history. It deposited volcanic ash across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and portions of Africa, and is believed to have caused a volcanic winter lasting several years, which in turn may have caused a catastrophic reduction in human population. The genetic evidence for this is the subject of ongoing debate, but some population geneticists have argued that the diversity of human mitochondrial DNA suggests a population bottleneck around this date, a period when the global human population may have dropped to as few as a few thousand individuals. If accurate, this represents a near-extinction event for the human lineage, an event that would have erased almost everything that any human culture had developed up to that point. The survivors would have been starting largely from scratch in a world whose previous human populations and their accumulated cultural and technological knowledge were mostly gone. This is speculative. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis as a cause of human population bottleneck is contested. but it illustrates the principle that the current state of human civilization is not the inevitable outcome of a smooth developmental trajectory. It is the product of survivors, of whatever remnants of knowledge were preserved through episodes of catastrophic loss, of the long reconstruction process that follows collapse. The island of Malta contains the oldest freestanding stone buildings in the world, predating the Egyptian pyramids by approximately 1,000 years. The Guntija temples on the island of Gozo, dated to approximately 3600 to 3200 BC, are built from massive limestone blocks, some weighing more than 50 tons, fitted together without mortar in a style that shares features with both the megalithic monuments of Atlantic Europe and the construction techniques of the Eastern Mediterranean. The internal spaces of the Maltese temples are sophisticated. The trefoil plan, with its sequence of apses, creates acoustic effects that appear to have been intentionally designed, channeling specific sound frequencies into the inner chambers in ways that would have made drumming and chanting inside the temples produce a qualitatively different acoustic experience from the same activities performed outdoors. Rupert Till at the University of Huddersfield has studied the acoustics of the Maltese temples and proposed that they were intentionally designed to create standing waves at specific frequencies associated with altered states of consciousness. Whether the builders understood the physics of acoustics in the way that a modern acoustic engineer would is not the relevant question. What matters is whether the effect was intentional, whether the builders knew from experience that this shape of room produced this kind of sound and built accordingly. The evidence suggests they did. The distribution of megalithic monuments along the Atlantic coast of Europe, from Morocco and Portugal in the south through Spain, France, Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia in the north, follows a pattern that does not fit neatly into the conventional picture of independent local development. The megalithic tradition appears in the archaeological record at roughly the same time across a very wide geographic area, in cultures that are sometimes assumed to have been in contact through Atlantic sea routes and sometimes assumed to have developed independently. The monuments share a consistent set of features: the use of large undressed or minimally dressed stones, the construction of chambered cairns and passage tombs, the astronomical orientation of the main axis towards significant solar or lunar events, and in many cases the careful acoustic engineering of the interior spaces. The builders shared practices, techniques, and possibly cosmological ideas across distances of several thousand kilometers. How this cultural coherence was maintained across such distances and across the centuries of the megalithic tradition's development is not fully understood. The most obvious mechanism is maritime trade and contact, and there is growing evidence for extensive Atlantic seafaring in the Neolithic period. But the coherence of the tradition, the consistent recurrence of the same features across such a wide area, suggests something more than occasional trading contact. It suggests a shared tradition of considerable depth and consistency. The Sphinx at Giza is aligned due east and faces the rising equinoctial sun. John Anthony West, following the suggestion of René Schwaller de Lubitsch, first proposed in the 1970s that the Sphinx showed evidence of water erosion on its body and enclosure walls. West argued that the vertical erosion patterns on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, which contrast with the horizontal wind and sand erosion patterns on other structures of the same limestone at Giza, were caused not by wind but by heavy rainfall, and that this rainfall would have been most prevalent during the African humid period, roughly 7,000 to 5,000 BC, when the Sahara was a much wetter environment. When West brought this hypothesis to the geologist Robert Schoch in 1990, Schoch, initially skeptical, examined the erosion patterns at Giza and concluded that West's argument had merit. Schoch's analysis, presented at the Geological Society of America in 1991, proposed that the Sphinx's body shows weathering consistent with prolonged exposure to significant rainfall, implying that the Sphinx was carved, or at least substantially completed, before the Saharan climate became the hyper-arid desert it is today, which would place its construction significantly earlier than the 4th dynasty attribution that Egyptology assigns to it. The Egyptological response was, and has remained, dismissive, pointing to the absence of any textual or archaeological evidence for an Old Kingdom sphinx predating Khafra, and arguing that the geological interpretation of the erosion patterns is incorrect. The debate continues. Schoch has since expanded his proposal, suggesting that the original sphinx dates to approximately 10,000 BC and that it was reworked and recarved in the 4th dynasty. The question of how sophisticated the ancient Egyptians were, how complete our picture of their capabilities actually is perhaps best illustrated not by the pyramids and temples that are so thoroughly photographed and studied, but by a small and comparatively obscure carved schist bowl in the Cairo Museum, catalogue number CG18793, commonly known as the tri-lobed disc or the Sabu disc. It was found in the Mastaba tomb of Sabu at Saqqara, a tomb dated to the 1st dynasty, approximately 3100 to 2900 BC. The disc is approximately 61 centimeters in diameter and is carved from a single piece of schist, a metamorphic rock of moderate hardness that, unlike granite, can be worked with bronze tools. What makes it extraordinary is its design: 3 curved lobes, each of which curves outward from the central hub and then curves back inward and down, creating the impression of 3 blades or veins rotating around a central axis, as if the disc were a stylized turbine or fan. The object has no obvious practical function that scholars have been able to identify. It was too fragile to have been used as a grindstone. Its schist construction means it would shatter under the mechanical stresses of being spun. It appears to have been made as a model, a 3-dimensional representation of something else, something whose physical form it captures without being a functional replica. What that something else might have been, whether it is a ritual representation, a stylized natural form, or a non-functional copy of a machine component, is unknown. But its precision and its sophistication of design in a tomb from the very beginning of the historical period is another reminder that the starting point of Egyptian civilization, as we know it, is already technically accomplished in ways that imply a long developmental tradition we have not recovered. The Emerald Tablet, the foundational text of the Western alchemical tradition, is attributed in the tradition to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, a legendary figure identified with both the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. The oldest known version of the text dates to an Arabic manuscript of approximately the 8th century AD, but the tradition consistently claims a much older origin for it, with some accounts tracing it to Atlantis and others to a pre-flood civilization identified with the antediluvian patriarchs of the Hebrew Bible. The text is short, a few hundred words at most, and consists of a series of cryptic statements about the nature of reality, the relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and the process by which base matter can be transformed into something more refined. Its most famous line, "As above, so below," as below, so above, is a statement of the principle of correspondence, the idea that the same patterns repeat at different scales of reality. The influence of this text on Western philosophy, science, and religion across 2,000 years has been enormous. Whether it preserves genuine ancient knowledge or is a later composition falsely attributed to antiquity is unknown, but the Hermetic tradition of which it is the foundation represents one of the persistent claims of a secret knowledge transmitted from a pre-flood civilization, preserved through cycles of destruction and transmission, and periodically recovered and reinterpreted by each succeeding culture that comes into contact with it. The Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica, which flourished from approximately 1500 to 400 BC and is considered the mother culture of all subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations, presents one of the most intriguing and most debated cases in the archaeology of lost or obscured histories. The Olmec created monumental art, specifically the colossal heads, 17 of which have been found, each depicting a unique individual wearing a distinctive helmet, with features that many observers have described as African. The African features argument that the colossal heads depict Africans and therefore that there was pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas has been made repeatedly and rejected repeatedly by mainstream archaeology, which argues that the features are consistent with Native American phenotypes. Ivan van Sertima's 1976 book They Came Before Columbus, which argued for pre-Columbian African contact with Mesoamerica, was extensively criticized for both its specific claims and its methodology. But the question of who the Olmec were, where they came from, and how they developed the specific complex of cultural practices and artistic traditions that characterized their civilization has not been fully answered. The Olmec writing system, called the Cascajal block script, was identified only in 2002 and remains undeciphered. Their language is unknown. Their connection to subsequent Mesoamerican cultures is inferred from architectural and artistic similarities, but not demonstrated textually. The Olmec remain one of the foundational mysteries of the Western Hemisphere's cultural history. The Pacific is the world's largest ocean and the most sparsely studied region for evidence of ancient maritime activity, but the distribution of crops, domestic animals, and genetic markers across Pacific Island populations reveals that the ancestors of the Polynesian people accomplished something extraordinary. They colonized virtually every habitable island in the Pacific, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south to Easter Island in the east, in a series of voyages that covered distances of hundreds and thousands of kilometers in open ocean, in double-hulled canoes navigating by stars, ocean swells, bird behavior, and cloud patterns. The Polynesian expansion, which began approximately 300–500 years ago and reached Easter Island by approximately 900 AD and Hawaii by approximately 1000 AD, is the largest voluntary migration in pre-modern human history. The navigational knowledge it required is genuinely extraordinary. The ability to maintain a course across open ocean without instruments, to find small islands in vast stretches of featureless water, to return home and come back again. This knowledge was accumulated and transmitted orally across generations of navigators. The recent revival of traditional Polynesian navigation, particularly through the Polynesian Voyaging Society and the voyages of the Hokulea, has demonstrated that this knowledge was real and functional and capable of guiding modern canoes on transoceanic voyages using only traditional methods. The implication is that the ancient Polynesians possessed a system of knowledge about the ocean and the sky that was sophisticated, reliable, and transmissible, a scientific tradition, though not one that looks like Western science. The Voynich manuscript, purchased in 1912 by the antiquarian bookseller Wilfrid Voynich from a Jesuit college in Frascati, is a handwritten illustrated codex in an unknown script and apparently an unknown language, dating from the early 15th century on the basis of carbon dating, though possibly copied from an earlier text. Its pages contain illustrations of plants that do not match any known species, astronomical or cosmological diagrams, human figures in circular pools connected by elaborate piping, pharmaceutical preparations, and pages of dense script that has resisted more than a century of cryptographic analysis by some of the world's most capable codebreakers. The British codebreaker William Friedman spent years on it. The NSA examined it. Computational linguists have applied statistical analysis to its letter and word distributions, confirming that the text has the statistical properties of a natural language, the frequency distributions of words, the patterns of letter combinations, the Zipfian distribution that characterizes all natural languages, but also some statistical properties that are unusual and not fully explained. Whether the Voynich manuscript encodes a real lost language, an invented language, a cipher, a hoax, or something else entirely, remains genuinely unknown. Its significance for the lost civilization question is not that it is necessarily the product of one. It almost certainly dates to the 15th century and is probably European in origin, but that it stands as a reminder of how much meaning can be present in a physical object and still be completely inaccessible. An entire language, if it is a language, an entire body of botanical or pharmaceutical knowledge, if the plant illustrations represent real plants we have not identified. All of it present, all of it legible in principle, and none of it yet read. The temple complex of Angkor in Cambodia covers an area of approximately 1,000 square kilometers, and at its peak, between the 9th and 15th centuries AD, was the largest pre-industrial city in the world, larger than any contemporary European city, larger than any city in the world at the time except perhaps Song dynasty Chinese cities at their height. The hydraulic engineering that made this city possible, a system of canals, reservoirs and distribution channels that managed the monsoon rains and provided water for year-round rice cultivation, was of extraordinary sophistication, and its failure in the 15th century apparently due to a combination of environmental degradation and the system's inability to cope with the extremes of the climate fluctuations of the Little Ice Age, contributed to the decline and eventual abandonment of the city. The specific astronomical alignments of Angkor Wat, the central temple of the complex, have been studied by Eleanor Maneker, who proposed that its dimensions encode significant astronomical measurements, including the lengths of the Vedic cosmological cycles and the position of the sun and moon at the spring equinox. Whether Maneker's specific measurements are accepted or not, the astronomical awareness of the Khmer architects is not in question. The temple is oriented to provide a specific solar alignment at the spring equinox, and this orientation is precise. Angkor stands as a reminder that the height of any civilization is not its most recent moment, and that collapse is both possible and rapid, and that the most sophisticated urban and engineering achievements of a culture can be swallowed by jungle and forgotten within centuries. The question that all of these individual sites and artifacts and anomalies collectively raise is not a single specific question. It is not asking us to choose between mainstream archaeology and any particular alternative theory. It is asking us to sit with a more fundamental uncertainty, that we do not know with the confidence that the standard narrative implies when human civilization began, how many times it has begun, or what has been lost in the catastrophes that punctuate its history. The record is patchy, the gaps are enormous, the evidence we have was preserved largely by chance, by the dryness of the Egyptian desert, by the accident that clay tablets baked in a fire that destroyed the library that contained them, by the remoteness of sites that delayed their discovery long enough for modern dating techniques to be applied. What was not preserved, the organic materials, the coastal settlements, the cities in the regions that are now underwater, vastly exceeds what was. The standard narrative is the best account we can give of the evidence we have. But acknowledging that the evidence we have is a tiny and non-representative sample of the evidence that once existed is not the same as endorsing any particular alternative narrative. It is simply being honest about the size of the unknown. There is a concept in the philosophy of science called the argument from ignorance, and it cuts in both directions in this discussion. The mainstream argument from ignorance says, we have found no definitive evidence of a sophisticated pre-glacial maximum civilization, therefore no such civilization existed. The alternative argument from ignorance says, we have not looked in the places where the evidence would be the seafloor, therefore the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Both of these are logically valid positions. What distinguishes them is what they imply about the appropriate response. The mainstream position implies that the current archaeological narrative is essentially complete and that additional revision should be incremental. The alternative position implies that major revision is possible and that the ocean floor, the Sahara, and other undersurveyed regions deserve more systematic attention. The latter position is, at minimum, scientifically productive in a way that the former is not, because it generates hypotheses that can in principle be tested. The technology to survey the seafloor systematically, to map and excavate submerged archaeological sites, now exists or is within reach. The question is whether the archaeological community will treat the submerged continental shelves as a genuine research priority before the evidence that might be there is further disturbed by deep-sea mining, trawling, and cable laying. The history of archaeology is, among other things, a history of things that were known and then forgotten and then rediscovered, and of assumptions that were held with great confidence and then overturned. Troy was mythology until Schliemann found it. The Minoan civilization did not exist in any scholarly awareness until Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos in 1900. The kingdom of Ebla, a major Bronze Age city-state in Syria, was completely unknown until its library of cuneiform tablets was discovered in 1975. The sophistication of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization was considered impossible given the supposed infertility of Amazonian soils until the discovery of terra preta, the deliberately engineered fertile dark soils created by centuries of human agricultural management, revealed that the Amazon basin had supported a large and complex civilization that was destroyed by disease following the European contact. The revision of the picture continues. It continues with Göbekli Tepe. It will continue with whatever is found next. The specific content of lost civilization research, the particular claims about Atlantis, about ancient technology, about pre-Diluvian cultures, may or may not be correct in its specifics, but the meta-claim, the claim that our current picture of human prehistory is incomplete in significant ways, is almost certainly correct. The question is not whether we are missing something. The question is what we are missing and how much. The megaliths of Karnak in Brittany, France, represent the largest concentration of prehistoric standing stones in the world. More than 3,000 stones are arranged in roughly parallel rows that extend for several kilometers across the landscape, interspersed with dolmens, passage tombs, and circular stone enclosures. The rows are not perfectly parallel. They diverge and converge slightly, and the stones within them vary considerably in height, with the tallest stones at the western end and the shortest at the eastern end, creating a graduated arrangement over several kilometers. The dating of the Karnak alignments is complex and not fully resolved. Some elements of the complex are associated with early Neolithic pottery and burial goods, suggesting construction beginning around 4500 to 4000 BC. Other elements may be older. The sheer scale of the undertaking, quarrying, transporting, and erecting 3,000 stones, some weighing several tons, across a landscape of several square kilometers, implies a level of social organization, collective labor, and sustained commitment to a single project that is difficult to account for in the standard picture of Neolithic communities as small, relatively egalitarian farming villages. Alexander Thom, the Scottish engineering professor who spent decades surveying Karnak and other megalithic monuments in the 1950s through 1970s, proposed that the alignments encoded astronomical information, including the precise determination of lunar standstills. The extreme positions in the 18.6-year lunar cycle, when the moon rises and sets at its most extreme northern and southern positions. If Thom's analysis is correct, the builders of Karnak possessed a remarkably sophisticated understanding of lunar mechanics and had been observing the moon carefully enough across multiple generations to determine the precise turning points of its long cycle. Newgrange, in County Meath, Ireland, is a passage tomb dated to approximately 3200 BC, making it older than Stonehenge and older than the Egyptian pyramids. It is a circular mound approximately 85 meters in diameter and 12 meters high, covering an internal passage and chamber that runs for approximately 19 meters into the heart of the mound. The passage and chamber are built from massive stones, and the corbelled ceiling of the chamber has remained watertight for 5,000 years without mortar. What makes Newgrange one of the most extraordinary astronomical monuments in the world is the roof box, a small aperture above the entrance to the passage, precisely positioned so that on the mornings around the winter solstice, for approximately 17 minutes, the rising sun shines directly through the roof box and along the full length of the 19-meter passage to illuminate the rear wall of the inner chamber. The alignment is not approximate, it is exact. The roof box's lintel is carved so that only sunlight arriving at the correct angle passes through it. At any other time of year, the passage remains dark. To engineer this alignment required precise observation of the sun's behavior across the full solar year, knowledge of the sun's position on the horizon at its most southern rising point, and the ability to translate that knowledge into a building orientation and a roof box geometry that would produce the desired effect 5,000 years later. It still works. On the morning of the winter solstice each year, the light enters the passage and illuminates the chamber, as it has done without interruption for 5,000 years. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, is one of the most discussed and most controversially interpreted documents in the history of cartography. It shows the western coast of Europe and Africa and the eastern coast of what appears to be South America, with considerable accuracy considering its date. What has generated controversy is the depiction in the map's southern portions of a landmass that some researchers have identified as Antarctica, which, if correctly identified, would imply that Antarctica was known to cartographers 2 centuries before its supposed European discovery in 1820, and moreover, that it was known in a form that shows the coastline of the continent under its current ice cover, which requires either that the information was gathered before the Antarctic ice sheet formed thousands of years ago, or that the ice-free coastline was somehow surveyed from below the ice. Charles Hapgood, the American academic who popularized this interpretation in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, argued that the Piri Reis map and several other early modern maps preserved information from a much older cartographic tradition. The accumulated geographical knowledge of a pre-glacial civilization that had surveyed the world's coastlines when they looked different from today. Hapgood's identification of the landmass as Antarctica has been challenged. Other cartographic historians argue that it is a distorted representation of the South American continent, or a hypothetical southern continent added to balance the map according to prevailing cosmological assumptions. The debate has not been definitively resolved, and the map's southern landmass remains an interpretive puzzle. The concept of the world age, or cosmic cycles of civilizational rise and fall, appears in the traditions of cultures across the world with a consistency that is striking. The Hindu tradition describes 4 yugas, the Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga, cosmic ages of decreasing length and decreasing human virtue, with the current age, the Kali Yuga, being the shortest and the most degenerate. The full cycle of all 4 yugas, the Mahayuga, lasts 4,120,000 years. The Maya long count calendar, which measures time from a creation date corresponding to August 11, 3114 BC in the proleptic Gregorian calendar, runs through a great cycle of approximately 5,025 years before resetting, though the 2012 reset date was not, as popular media claimed, the Maya prediction of the end of the world, but simply the end of one great cycle and the beginning of the next. The Greek tradition describes 5 ages of humanity, from the Golden Age through the Silver, Bronze, Heroic, and Iron Ages, each representing a decline from the perfection of the first. The Norse tradition describes the current world as destined to end in Ragnarok, after which a new and better world will emerge. The Aztec tradition describes 5 suns, 5 previous worlds, each ended by a catastrophe, with the current world being the 5th sun. These traditions do not map onto each other precisely, and their cosmological specifics differ significantly, but the underlying pattern that we live in a fallen or diminished world that follows a catastrophe that destroyed a better one, and that this process repeats in cycles, is essentially universal. Whether this pattern represents genuine historical memory of repeated cycles of civilizational rise and collapse, or whether it represents a universal human psychological tendency to project the individual experience of decay and decline onto the cosmos, is a question that cannot be answered from the evidence alone. The city of Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, dated to approximately 7500 to 5700 BC, is one of the best documented Neolithic settlements in the world and provides some of the most detailed evidence we have for the interior life of a prehistoric community. It was a city of considerable size. At its peak, it may have housed between 5,000 and 10,000 people, living in densely packed mud brick houses accessible only from the roof, with no streets between them. The houses were decorated with elaborate painted murals, with bull skulls set into the walls, with figurines of a large female figure that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of a goddess cult. The material culture of Çatalhöyük shows evidence of long-distance trade, obsidian from Cappadocia, shells from the Mediterranean coast, ochre and flint from distant sources. Its burial practices and the dead were often buried beneath the floors of the houses, beneath the sleeping areas, in a practice that implies a continuous relationship between the living and the dead in the same physical space, are unlike anything in later historic traditions, and suggest a cosmological relationship with ancestry and with place that we have no direct parallel for in recorded religion. Çatalhöyük is important for the lost civilization question, not because it is lost, it is one of the best documented Neolithic sites, but because it demonstrates how sophisticated, how populous, how architecturally complex, and how cosmologically rich a community could be in the 7th millennium BC, more than 4,000 years before the first appearance of writing, and more than 1,000 years before Göbekli Tepe is believed to have been deliberately buried. The oral traditions of the Hopi people of the American Southwest describe a series of previous worlds called the First, Second, and Third Worlds, each of which was destroyed because the people who lived in them became corrupt or lost their spiritual connection. The Third World was destroyed by a great flood. The survivors were led by the spider grandmother, a creator deity, to the current world, the Fourth World, where they were instructed to live in harmony with the earth. The specific physical details of the Hopi flood account, the construction of rafts and the sealing of boats, the sending out of birds to find land, the eventual emergence onto dry ground, parallel the Mesopotamian and biblical flood accounts closely enough to suggest either cultural diffusion, which is very difficult to account for given the geographic and historical separation, or independent derivation from a common memory of an actual event. The anthropologist Frank Waters, in his 1963 book Book of the Hopi, documented the Hopi oral tradition extensively and noted the remarkable structural and substantive similarities between it and flood traditions from around the world. The Hopi response to these similarities, when Waters raised them, was that the similarities were natural, that all human beings, wherever they lived, had passed through the same world-ending events, and that the different cultural versions of those events were all accounts of the same things. This is the indigenous position. Not that the myths are symbolic, not that they are independently invented metaphors for the same universal human experiences, but that they are the preserved memories of actual events that affected all of humanity. The underwater ruins off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni were not the only anomalous structures found in the waters of the Pacific in the late 20th century. Off the coast of Okinawa, at a site called the Kurama Islands, divers reported in the 1990s finding carved stone arches and pillared formations at depths between 20 and 40 meters. Off the coast of Cuba in 2001, the underwater exploration company Advanced Digital Communications, using sonar mapping, reported finding geometrically arranged stone structures at a depth of approximately 600 to 700 meters, much too deep to have been exposed by late Pleistocene sea level changes, which is one of the reasons the discovery generated both excitement and skepticism. A subsequent expedition confirmed the sonar images, but a proposed follow-up archaeological survey was never completed to the degree necessary to make definitive determinations. The structures, if they are structures, sit in water deep enough that their existence at the surface would require either that the Cuban continental shelf was above water during a period of much lower sea levels than the late Pleistocene maximum, which would push the date back far beyond any mainstream estimate of human civilizational capacity, or that the structures were built underwater, which is extraordinary, or that the sonar images are misinterpreted natural formations. None of these explanations is satisfying, and the site remains uninvestigated at the level of detail that would resolve the question. The problem of the Mu or Lemuria hypothesis ties with the idea that there was once a sunken continent in the Pacific or Indian Ocean whose inhabitants were the founders of Pacific and Asian civilizations before the continent sank, is that the geology flatly contradicts it. Continental geology does not allow for the rapid submergence of an entire continent. Continental crust is less dense than oceanic crust and will not sink beneath it regardless of the mechanisms invoked. The early 20th century versions of the sunken Pacific continent hypothesis, most prominently associated with James Churchward's 4 books published in the 1920s and 1930s, are based on a misreading of geological evidence and a misinterpretation of Mayan and Nahuatl texts. The geological objection is decisive. Mu cannot have existed in the form that Churchward described it. But the cultural connections that Churchward and others were trying to explain, the similarities between the creation myths of Polynesia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, the distribution of specific cultural practices, the linguistic relationships between the Austronesian languages that span from Madagascar to Hawaii, are real phenomena that require explanation. The explanation modern scholarship has converged on is the prehistoric expansion of Austronesian-speaking peoples from Taiwan approximately 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, spreading through the Philippines, Indonesia, and eventually across the Pacific and back to Madagascar. This is not as dramatic as a sunken continent, but it is its own kind of extraordinary story, and the level of navigational capability it required was itself extraordinary. The relationship between the ancient Egyptian tradition and the earlier Mesopotamian tradition is one of the less discussed but potentially most important threads in the history of early civilization. The two traditions are usually treated as independent, with the Sumerian city-states developing their distinctive urban culture in the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, and the Egyptian tradition developing separately along the Nile. There is increasing evidence, however, of contact and cultural transmission between the two regions in the pre-dynastic period before the beginning of the Egyptian historical record. Cylinder seals, a specifically Mesopotamian art form, appear in pre-dynastic Egyptian contexts. Architectural features characteristic of early Mesopotamian construction appear at Hierakonpolis and other early Egyptian sites. The iconography of combat, showing a ruler dominating enemies, appears in both traditions at roughly the same time. Whether this evidence indicates direct contact, trade, or migration, or more complex forms of cultural diffusion mediated by intermediate cultures in the Levant, is debated, but the possibility that the two traditions share some common root, that they both drew on an even older cultural tradition that had flourished in the region before the historical record begins, is consistent with the evidence without being required by it. The cultural tradition that preceded both Sumer and Egypt, if it existed, would date to the period whose evidence lies on the seafloor of the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The phenomenon of independent invention versus cultural diffusion is one of the central methodological debates in anthropology and archaeology, and it is directly relevant to the question of lost civilizations. When the same feature, a specific technological solution, a specific ritual practice, a specific astronomical orientation, appears in cultures separated by oceans and centuries, there are only three possible explanations. It was invented independently by each culture. It was transmitted from one culture to another through contact we have not documented, or it was inherited from a common ancestor that preceded both. The mainstream tends to favor independent invention for most cases of cross-cultural similarity, partly because the alternatives require either extensive undocumented contact or the existence of an unknown common ancestor civilization, both of which are more speculative than independent invention. But independent invention, while certainly possible, strains credulity when the specific features being compared are complex, precise, and non-obvious. The specific orientation of a monument to the winter solstice sunrise is not the kind of feature that independent inventors would be expected to arrive at by chance. The specific representation of a flood myth with a warning from a deity, a vessel, surviving animals, and a mountain landing is not a feature that diverse cultures would independently invent with such consistent detail. At some point, the coincidences become too numerous and too specific to be explained by independent invention, and the choice between documented contact and unknown common ancestor has to be made on the available evidence. The stone circles of the Atacama Desert in Chile and the enigmatic geoglyphs of the adjacent coastal regions, different in style and content from the more famous Nazca lines but equally puzzling in their extent and their apparent purposefulness, are part of a broader pattern of large-scale ground-level art across South America that archaeologists have been documenting and debating for decades. The Atacama is one of the driest places on Earth, which means that features placed on its surface are exceptionally well preserved, and the concentration of petroglyphs, geoglyphs, and stone arrangements in the region is extraordinary. Some of the Atacama geoglyphs depict animals recognizable from the local fauna. Others appear to represent humans or anthropomorphic figures in positions that suggest ritual or astronomical significance. Some are so large that their full form is visible only from significant altitude. The methodological challenge of interpreting these figures is that their meaning is not recoverable from the figures themselves. They are images without captions, shapes without explanations, and the cultures that made them left no text that explains their purpose. The most intellectually honest position is that we do not know what they meant to the people who made them, and that any interpretation we offer is shaped more by our own assumptions about what ancient people thought about than by evidence from those people themselves. The archaeoacoustics of prehistoric monuments is an emerging field that has produced a series of findings that are genuinely extraordinary, and that the broader archaeological community has been slow to integrate into its narratives. The basic finding is consistent across multiple sites. The internal spaces of many prehistoric monuments, stone circles, passage tombs, cave sites, temples, produce specific acoustic effects that appear to have been intentionally designed. At Stonehenge, the specific arrangement of the stones creates standing wave patterns at certain frequencies that would have been particularly pronounced during the original monument configuration before many of the stones fell or were removed. At the passage tomb of Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire, the chamber produces a resonance at a frequency associated with a male voice intoning at a specific pitch. At the Maltese temples, as previously mentioned, specific frequencies are amplified in the inner chambers. At the cave sites of Lascaux, Altamira, and Font de Gaume, the painted caves of the Upper Paleolithic, Igor Reznikov and Michel Dauvois surveyed the acoustic properties of the caves in the 1980s and found that the painted areas within the caves, the areas where the concentration of images was highest, consistently corresponded to the areas of the caves with the most significant acoustic resonance. The paintings were placed where the echoes were loudest, where a drum or a chant produced the most dramatic acoustic effect. This correlation is not perfect and is not without alternative explanations, but its consistency across multiple cave sites suggests that the creators of the cave art were aware of the acoustic properties of the spaces they were decorating and treated those properties as significant. Sound in the world of prehistoric ritual was not incidental to the sacred space, it was constitutive of it. The question of ancient knowledge of electricity has been raised periodically by researchers pointing to the Baghdad battery, a ceramic jar with a copper cylinder and an iron rod found in the vicinity of Baghdad and dated to roughly the Parthian period, around 250 BC to 250 AD. When filled with an acidic solution such as grape juice or vinegar, the jar produces a small electrical current, approximately a volt and a half. Wilhelm Koenig, the German archaeologist who first described the artifact in 1938, proposed that it was used for electroplating, and subsequent experiments confirmed that a device of this type could be used to deposit a thin layer of gold or silver onto a metal object. The mainstream position is that the Baghdad battery is a coincidental storage vessel whose resemblance to a galvanic cell is unintentional, and that there is no other evidence in the Parthian archaeological record of electrical knowledge. The alternative position is that the device represents a practical knowledge of galvanic electricity that was not theoretically understood. The artisans who used it may not have known what electricity was, but they knew that filling the jar produced an effect useful for metalworking. The distinction matters because practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge are historically separable. Practical metallurgical techniques were highly sophisticated in ancient cultures millennia before any theoretical understanding of chemistry was developed. Whether the Baghdad battery was intentionally designed as a galvanic cell or is a coincidental construction is a question the physical evidence alone cannot resolve, but it is not, as it is sometimes dismissively treated, an obviously settled question. The Bosnian pyramid controversy that erupted in 2005 when Sam Osmanagic announced that the Visočica hill near Visoko in Bosnia and Herzegovina was an ancient pyramid has been one of the most contentious and most poorly handled debates in recent archaeological history. Osmanagic claims that the hill is a man-made pyramid approximately 30,000 years old, the largest in the world, have been rejected by mainstream European archaeology with a forcefulness that sometimes shaded into personal attack, and the rejection has been largely justified by the evidence. Independent geological surveys of the Visočica hill have consistently found that its pyramidal shape is the result of natural geological processes, specifically the differential erosion of alternating beds of mudstone and sandstone along the northwest-southeast strike of the regional geology. The geometric regularity is real but geological. The specific blocks of sandstone that Osmanagic interpreted as dressed stone surfaces are natural bedding plane fractures. The extreme age claimed is supported by no reliable dating. The fringe archaeology community's embrace of the Bosnian pyramid as evidence of a lost civilization, and the mainstream archaeology community's occasionally intemperate rejection of any investigation at all have between them produced a situation in which the genuine archaeological potential of the Visoko region, which contains real Bronze Age and medieval remains of considerable interest, has been overshadowed and distorted. The controversy illustrates the difficulties of conducting sober inquiry at the intersection of genuine scientific questions and popular enthusiasm for ancient mysteries. The DNA of modern human populations carries evidence of prehistoric events that archaeology has not yet been able to account for in the physical record. The work of population geneticists, particularly David Reich at Harvard and Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, has revealed a series of ancient population movements and admixtures that correspond to no historically documented migration. One of the most striking is the evidence for a large-scale population movement from an as-yet unidentified source into South Asia that contributed significantly to the ancestry of modern South Asians, and that appears to have been distinct from both the steppe populations that brought Indo-European languages to the subcontinent and the existing Indus Valley population. This mysterious ancestry, sometimes called the ancestral South Indian population, appears in the genetic record without a clear archaeological correlate. We can see its genetic signature in modern populations, but we have not yet identified the archaeological culture it represents. Similarly, the genetic evidence for the peopling of the Americas remains more complex than the standard model of a single migration from Siberia via the Beringia land bridge. There is genetic evidence for at least 2 distinct migration events, one of which brought a population with genetic affinities to Australasian peoples into South America, apparently before the main Siberian-derived migration. How a population with Australasian genetic ancestry reached South America before or around the same time as the Siberian-derived population is a question that no current model of human migration satisfactorily answers. The last thing to consider, and the one that perhaps matters most for how we hold all of the preceding questions, is this. Civilization is not a ratchet. It does not inevitably move forward. It does not automatically preserve its own achievements. The Bronze Age collapse, which occurred around 1200 BC and destroyed the palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean within a generation, eliminated writing in the Mycenaean Greek world. Linear B script disappeared and was not replaced for approximately 4 centuries. Rome's engineering knowledge, including the specific composition of Roman concrete that is superior in many respects to modern concrete, was lost after the fall of the Western Empire and not recovered in full until the 21st century. The medical knowledge of the ancient world was repeatedly lost and rediscovered. The Greek mathematical tradition was preserved not in the West, but in the Islamic world during the European Middle Ages, and its reintroduction to Europe through Arabic translations of Greek originals was one of the catalysts of the Renaissance. Knowledge is fragile, cities burn, libraries are sacked, oral traditions die when their carriers die, and the deeper in time you look, the fewer carriers there are, the fewer written records, the fewer physical structures that survive, and the larger the gaps between what we know and what we need to know to understand how human beings arrived at this moment in this world. The mysteries of lost civilization are not embarrassing remnants of a pre-scientific age of credulity. They are the honest acknowledgement that the human story is longer and stranger and more repeatedly catastrophic than the standard narrative has the time or the institutional incentive to fully represent. We are not the end point of history. We are the current survivors, and the knowledge of those who came before us, much of it, is somewhere beneath the water or the sand or the jungle or the silence of a tradition that ended before it could be written down. Sleep well. The ground beneath you has more history in it than any library has yet read.